There's simply no way to summarize John Cusack's career. From 16 Candles to Better Off Dead, Say Anything, High Fidelity, and Being John Malkovich, he has helped inspire and entertain moviegoers for decades. Today, he is here to share his new movie with us, The Raven. Please give a warm Chicago welcome to John Cusack.
I know. I mean, the camera feed's so good.
What's going on? How you guys doing? Happy Sunday. Yeah. And socks. Yep.
Awesome. So obviously, this movie it's a blend of history and fantasy. It's not the true thing that happened at the end of his life, but there is a lot of mystery around the end of his life. Talk about that as like a starting point.
Well, Poe was he was like a master of. He basically created Gothic horror, and he created the detective genre. He created Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Basically attributed Sherlock Holmes to his Inspector Dauphin, who did a lot of his stories. He also wrote stories like futuristic science fiction stories that influenced Jules Verne. He would write like parodies and hoax, and he would write like crazy slasher horror stuff, as well as being one of the greatest poets who ever lived. So he was like this great mashup of styles and stuff. So he also had a really tragic life, so no one knows what happened in the last 4 or 5 days of his life. It was always a mystery. So the conceit of the film is that he becomes enveloped in one of his own stories. There's like a copycat killer who starts to reenact his stories, his horror stories, and then he starts to weave or pulls Poe into one of his stories. So it enables you to sort of have Poe have to deconstruct Poe, because he has to try to find out what the mind of the killer is, and the killer is trying to be Poe. So it's a little bit of that dream within a dream thing. So it allows you to sort of get into his work in a really cool way, which is probably a little less boring than a biopic. But I think it's pretty cool.
While you were making this, what did you kind of discover about Poe that you didn't know previously?
Well, I didn't know that he was, I forgot how much his literature affected so much of pop culture. There wouldn't be a CSI Miami, and there probably wouldn't even be wouldn't have been a Sherlock Holmes, or every from Stephen King all the way on to every classic horror writer. It all stems from Edgar Allan Poe. So I didn't know about that, and I also didn't know that he was kind of funny. He was some of his stories were like sort of dark, absurdist, very twisted stuff, and I didn't know how combative he was. Like he went to West Point, and he basically didn't like men. He just liked being in the company of women. So they said about him that they don't think that he ever said any good word about any other living writer, living or dead. Anybody who wrote in the English language, Poe put down. He had to be the best. Like he was a real kind of psycho in a lot of ways. So he was really crazy, like really eccentric, crazy writer, and obviously he had a bad alcohol problem. So he was like a classic genius, crazy writer. I think like the people who are icons become flat after a while. It's like Charlie Chaplin with the Tramp, and you just go, okay, there's the guy on the postage stamp. But then when you read about his life, and you realize that, this guy was, he wrote The Raven, and it was the most famous poem in the world. He actually went to the White House. He was drunk, actually, when he went to the White House. But since there was no copyright, he couldn't get paid, so he got paid a couple bucks for that. It got printed around the world, but he was still living in a hovel and trying to write, living hand to mouth. So he was like dirt poor and always living in tragedy. And then just how much he also had a lot of tragedy in his life. His mother died of tuberculosis, and then he sort of found a stepmother, and then she died of tuberculosis, and then he married his cousin who was 13, and then she died of tuberculosis. So he called consumption the family disease. he kept having this juxtaposing, like being, having this deep love for these women that he sort of adored with almost like in a religious way, and he would mix that with, the horror of losing them and the horror of, disease and, casual violence at the time and stuff. So he was always juxtaposing beauty and horror, and that's why he's the godfather of goth, That's why so he was sort of the first to do all that. So he wouldn't really have, he wouldn't have Sushi and the Banshees either if it wasn't for him. Musically, there's just, his influence just goes out, in so many ways exponentially. So I didn't realize that until I started reading again and researching. Because I sort of just, so he's kind of this, he's a real sad Halloween guy. He's like, real depressed, right? And he hangs out in graveyards. Okay, got it. But when I started doing research, he was a fascinating guy, fascinating character.
Did you dig into all his writings while you were studying for this?
Yeah, because back then nobody had cell phones, so when they wanted to write, they wanted to talk to each other, they'd either go travel and see him, or they would write him letters. So he has all these letters you can read.
Do you lament the sort of loss of that in our society, the letter?
No, I like texting. But yeah, I like letters too. But it's just great because you have that record of looking into how he is, and you can see how he was with people. And you can see letters to his. He has. There's great letters to his father when he had taken his money at West Point or wherever he was, and he had gambled and drunk away the money. And he calls and asks for more money, and the father says, "No, you can't have any more." And he goes, "Your love I never valued." And he just this really melodramatic thing that he wrote. So it's pretty interesting to be able to go back and see all those things.
Yeah, I've loved Poe's writing for a while, and I think one of my favorite things is the telltale heart, just how
yeah, it's really.
There's a lot of angst there. What was some of your favorite stuff while you were taking through his writing?
I love all those things like the Telltale Heart, Murders of the Rue Morgue. I like all that stuff that was the. There's like different themes he had. Some of it is just always like a person going crazy. Like the Telltale Heart is a guy who thinks this guy's doing something and whispering in the other room, and he ends up having to actually kill him, and then he takes his heart and takes his body, dismembers him, puts his heart under the floorboard, then he thinks he hears the beating of the heart. I mean, it's pretty wild stuff. So there's the stuff about like a guy going crazy, and then there's stuff that's more like allegorical, where it's like the Mask of the Red Death, where you literally see death coming into the palace gates on a horse, and it's death on a horse, and I guess it's supposed to be the plague or the disease of the time, Fall of the House of Usher, where like the whole house actually represents the family lineage that's sort of been decaying and crumbling, and inevitably crumbles back into the marsh. That's a great one. King Pest, Hop Frog, about a dwarf, an alcoholic dwarf who takes revenge on a king. Pretty good story.
And that one's actually a little funnier too.
That's funny and absurd. Yeah, that's really bizarre. Descent into the Maelstrom. They're really great stories.
Mentioning humor, how much of that kind of makes its way into this movie?
Well, a lot of it does, because he was sort of somebody who was sort of at war with the world in a sense, and he had sort of a gallows humor and a really, really sharp tone. So those characters are really eccentric. I don't think it would be really fun to be that person, but I think it's sort of fun to look at him from a distance.
I think he's always walking this line between the light and the darkness, and sometimes descends into it. I think you mentioned before that you were going into the abyss playing this character. Was it ever exhausting at the end of the day to put so much of this into the character? Were you ever kind of exhausted on set after this?
Yeah, well, it was. We were in Serbia, and it was in the winter, and it was really cold and wet, so we were far away from the States. It was just sort of like you just immerse yourself in it, and have fun in the graveyard.
As an artist, I can't imagine a worse fate than having something that you've crafted be, turn into violent, bloody murder. Did you think about that as an artist while you were doing this movie? Like, think about what would happen if something I did was used as, a reason for somebody to commit these acts?
Yeah, I've thought about that. Like, I guess it would be a little bit like, Taxi Driver with Jodie Foster with a guy who shot John Lennon because of that movie. I guess that would probably be pretty troubling.
Yeah, exactly. So
suck.
Would suck. Besides sort of the Raven being Poe's best known work, what is the significance of it to the movie itself?
Well, I think the Raven poem is what got him worldwide fame, and it sort of turned him into a bit of a rock star of the day. So even though he didn't have any money, he was known to be one of the greatest writers in America. So that sort of started his kind of world fame. And then he started to write criticism in other papers, and he would be attacking other writers. And he was just very public and very vocal, and he was really famous. So I guess that's what draws the copycats in. It basically gave him a bunch of fame in his day.
There's a famous obituary that came out upon his death that was written by a rival writer, right? And
yeah.
He kind of takes Poe to task a little bit in his obituary, which I found interesting.
Yeah, and then actually in the movie, he becomes the guy on the pendulum stage. Griswold was the guy who was one of his. Poe had a lot of enemies when he was alive, and that sort of led to him. After he died, he really wasn't appreciated so much. And then a little bit later, the French poets really loved him, and they brought him back into kind of popular consciousness, and then he got weird again. But he had a lot of enemies who are other writers. And it's a little bit of a swipe at critics too, I think, criticism.
Which is probably, totally fun to play as somebody who is critically sort of, talked about.
Yeah, well, no, it was, Poe comes in and finds the guy, just cut in half, so I don't know if I want to do that to any critics.
A little subconscious wish fulfillment.
Yeah, maybe. No, but I'm lucky. They're usually really pretty nice to me, but I'm sure it would be some sort of gallows humor in that or something.
So you worked with James McTeague on this, who also directed V for Vendetta, and that was, obviously a direct take on graphic novel. Do you look at this as sort of a graphic novel-esque movie?
A little bit different, I think, because it all comes from the source material. So the Poe stories and that Gothic tradition is a little less sort of doesn't have that graphic comic book feel, but there's some similarities, I think. But it all just comes from the source, I think, source material.
Had you talked to him or